they got rid of it. They got rid of the 10, so I bought them. Trying to dump them so they can get their 11s or 12s or whatever. All right, so after the Curtis Act, 1898, an allotment, then comes the Burke Act, and it was 1908, and this is referred to as an act for the removal of restrictions from part of the lands of the allotted of allotments of the 5 civilized tribes and for other purposes. So this is specific. So here's like a quiz question. True or false? The Burke Act applied only to the 5 civilized tribes. True. Okay. Essentially, the law affected the restrictions on those allotments made to the 5 civilized tribes allottees: the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole. And in those allotted acreages, remember that each allotment varied according to the allottee. Remember that? Because it was a share of the total estate rather than just a homestead, which is a little better deal, I think, you can say, for the 5 tribes. However, you know that the 5 tribes had these homestead allotments and these surplus allotments. So this law affected those. And my batteries are dead on this pointer thing, but since the average acreage varied per allottee, the typical amount that someone received was usually over 160 acres, so there were more than 160 acres per allottee typically. And other than the town sites, because town sites, what are you talking about? Yeah, town sites. Allotment in the Indian Territory didn't start until 1900, really, 1899, 1900. And by that time, there were towns. When was the first town established in Indian Territory? Well, if you go, technically it's like Salina, because Salina was a fur trading post way back into the days of the Choteaus. But the Katy Railroad came through in 1871, built through in 1871, and was operational by 1872. And along the Katy Railroad, and if you know remember where the Katy Railroad is, it comes up through, I think it's Sherman, Texas, and goes out through like Baxter Springs, Kansas, or somewhere. So the Katy Railroad, the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railroad, enters Chickasaw Nation and then passes real quickly into the Choctaw Nation, up through the Creek Nation, and across the Cherokee Nation. So all 4 of the 5 civilized tribes had land that was crossed by the Katy Railroad, and that was intentional on the part of the Missouri, Kansas, Texas Railroad. They were trying to tap agricultural products produced in Indian Territory in the 1870s. Well, from 1872 and even 1871, because as they were constructing the railroad, a lot of towns got started as railroad construction camps. So they had to have a place to house all the workers who were working on the railroad, and those would sometimes develop into stations along the road. So what are some stations along the Katy Railroad that you can think of? I don't have a map handy, but I believe that would include, let's go south to north, I believe that would include Ardmore, and I may be wrong on this completely, McAllister, Muskogee, Wagner, Veneta, maybe Miami, I can't remember. But some of the oldest, largest towns in Indian Territory got started in the 1870s, and so by the time of allotment, they're 20, 25, 30 years old. A town that's 20, 25, 30 years old how in the world did that work if the land was held in communal ownership in the 5 tribes area? Bizarre, isn't it? Ever stop and think about that? If you were a real estate person, a real estate developer, how in the world would it be possible for you to give somebody a loan for constructing a business building, like a bank, like a big old sandstone, brick bank for a town like Muskogee? Muskogee was big by the time of allotment. It was attracting lots of people. It had actually several railroads passing through it by 1900. So there were towns that developed on land that did not have secure title. Okay, and this was really significant. There had to have developed some sort of system in which property rights were recognized by the tribe, right, at least for real estate, in order to construct business buildings and rent those business buildings. Sounds pretty risky, doesn't it? And it was. So when allotment came through, allotment was the whole idea that you would allot land according to the value of the land, to the shares, and equitable shares to the rightful heirs of the estate, right? How in the world are you going to do that when you have urban real estate with a 4-story sandstone building on it? What's the value of that land, So what the allottee, or what the allotment process did, or actually it was called the town site inspector, the commission on town sites for the 5 civilized tribes, as a government commission. What they did was they drew a boundary around the town, or around the many towns. There were over 100 towns with urban real estate, with valuable urban real estate, but no title to the real estate in a legal sense. So what they did was they drew a boundary around the developed limits of the town, and they called that the segregated town site. So my point here, where it says other than town sites and other than timber resources and coal mining resources, most of the 5 civilized tribes' domain was divided, divided among citizens, okay? So there were 3 types, this would be a good question, 3 types of land within the 5 tribes region that was not allotted. It was not allotted, at least to the members of the tribe. Okay? And those were the town sites, which were segregated. In other words, they were kind of reserved from the allotment. And down around Broken Bow and the areas where Wright City and some of these logging towns that were cutting the good pine timber down in the Ouachita Mountains of southeastern Oklahoma and the Choctaw Nation, those valuable timberlands, rather than being allotted to an individual, were reserved. They were segregated, as they called it segregation of those good lands, or those valuable resource lands. They segregated that from the allottable domain. And the same thing with the area around McAllister and Krebs, an area that was known to be a very, very accessible coal mining region. It already developed as a coal mining region by 1900, and there were even Italian and other European immigrant miners living in Krebs and McAllister. And anybody ever been to McAllister or Krebs? Okay, so you know about the Italian family heritage down there, and also Russian and Ukrainian. names and families. So those folks were attracted, or they were often recruited to come to Indian Territory to work and mine, that sort of thing. So those three types of resources, towns aren't really resources, those types of real estate, town sites, coal mining resources, coal mining areas, and timber resources. And the timber and the mines were both in the Choctaw Nation. Those were segregated from allotments, so none of the allottees got that. None of the allottees got those things. What did they do with them? What do you reckon they did with them? Well, the town sites were surveyed, and the buildings on those town sites were surveyed into lots, and basically held an auction and sold that real estate to the highest bidder. And most of the time, the store owner or the person who had claim to that building or real estate, they had claim to it through the Cherokee Nation. You know, it wasn't a title under formal United States, property rights, but it was a claim in the Cherokee Nation law. Those people had the ability to bid on their lot, and they essentially purchased the real estate underneath their buildings, whether they were houses or business buildings within the town sites like Muskogee and Ardmore and Veneta, places like that. So the revenue generated from those sales of real estate then went to the balance that the United States held in trust for each of those nations. So essentially, it was the nation, the people did not get that real estate. Now, if they were Cherokee citizens and they bid on it, they could do that, they could purchase it, but it was not going to be restricted. Okay, so what the town site segregation did was it kept that urban real estate from ever going into a restricted status, which was, can you imagine the complications of that? So anyway, that was, you could be a Native American, a citizen of the tribe, and purchase your lot, that's no problem, but you're not going to be purchasing Indian country. It's not going to be Indian country after that. It was just designated as segregated lands, and so the title to that land lost its Aboriginal title. It lost its original Indian title. Therefore, the United States compensated the tribe with the proceeds from those sales. With the timber sales, they did something similar to that. And the coal were handled in the same way. They were the federal government leased that land to private developers. So in the case of the coal mine, the coal lands in the McAllister coal field, the Choctaw Nation had already set an agreement up with the person who developed it, a guy by the name of J.J. McAllister, who had married into the Choctaw Nation. So the Choctaw Nation was already leasing out those mineral rights for that development. And the federal government just took over from that. The coal would play out pretty quickly in the early 20th century. It was not economical to produce very much after 1920 or 1915 even. And the same thing went with the timber resources down in the southeast part of the state, and those timber resources would then be held and made into, what happened? What did they make them into? Federal land made them into national forests, okay? And then some of those lands were also purchased by the Dirks Timber Company, Dirks Lumber Company, which then later became Weyerhaeuser. So Weyerhaeuser was the big owner for a long time, and I don't think it's Weyerhaeuser anymore. But anyway, what I'm trying to get at is, it's not as easy as, the planners back in New England, supposed. It's a lot more difficult, a lot more complex. You got towns, you got valuable resources, natural resources that everybody would probably want. So how do you value that? You just segregate it and then sell it off or lease it off. So the 5 tribes' lands were treated as estates, we know that. There was no surplus lands open to non-Indians other than those segregated ones that were sold or leased. The so-called mixed bloods, the people who were intermarried, there are 2 types. There are people who were tribal citizens, but maybe just a quarter or an eighth blood quantum. And then there were people who were married into the tribe, and so they had legal rights. Their spouses had legal rights as tribal citizens. And freedmen, people who were former slaves or descendants of former slaves of the 5 civilized tribes. All of those people together greatly outnumbered the tribal citizens who were between 1/2 blood quantum and 100% or full blood, and so they. The point here is that allotment, often included a lot of non-Indians in Indian territory. Okay, by non-Indians I mean people who are of maybe partial ancestry but are legally Indian, who are not Indian but intermarried and have legal ties to the tribe, and people who by law were recognized as having the rights to receive allotted land when that would happen. In the case of the freedmen, and freedmen also were intermarried with tribal citizens as well. Remember that. So what I'm trying to get at is the population of the 5 tribes who received allotments was fairly diverse. It was actually really diverse. It was not like the example of the Ponca or the Oto Missouri that we've talked about on the reservation. These are people who have been here for generations and intermarried and multiracial, people who trace their ancestry through blood quantum, but also had a full citizenship because the roles that were taken were based on blood quantum and whether or not they identified as a citizen. Now, one last thing I want to reiterate, and we've talked about this before, was that in the case of the 5 civilized tribes allotments, the mineral rights, that is the rights to the oil and gas and coal and other mineral resources, were also allotted with the surface rights. And this was generally the case throughout most of the United States. The glaring exception being the Osage Nation. Okay, Osage, you all know about how the Osage were different. Osage Reservation, Osage Nation. The Osages had the very good foresight to not distribute mineral rights with the allotments. They held the mineral rights in common, and still do. And what they did was establish a system called a headright system, in which shares of the royalties from mineral wealth, from oil and gas production, the royalty went to the tribe, and then those royalties were distributed based on the headright share. So it was like a finite number of shares that then could be subdivided. So you inherit, if you're Osage, or if you're intermarried to the Osages, you can inherit those headrights. You can inherit that proportion of the royalty, a proportion of a share of a royalty. So it's passed down through generations in terms of a collection or a fraction of a share of the royalty that the tribe receives from oil and gas revenue. So think of it as like a long-term investment in that case. A lot of Osage head rights, of course, were lost, and they're making a big movie about this, and following the best-selling book. And what's the title of the book? Something about. Not familiar with that? And my wife's got the book, but I can't remember what name of the title. It's a murder mystery. And in fact, the Federal Bureau of Investigation kind of cut its teeth on investigating what are referred to as the Osage murders back in the 1920s here in Oklahoma, because what happened was there was a string of homicides associated with getting access to Osage mineral rights or Osage head rights, basically controlling those that income stream. I'm not very familiar with it, sorry, but we'll see maybe more about that book and that story. So anyway, the Osages made a really good decision by keeping that common. In other words, they didn't allow those mineral rights to be alienated to non-Indians, at least directly. Some head rights did, but it's a complex story. All right, now the Burke Act was very much based on ideas of race and so-called blood quantum. So if you were an intermarried white, if you were an African American descended person who had rights to an allotment on the freedman roll, or if you were a descendant of somebody on the freedman rolls, or if you were of less than 1/2 blood quantum, 1/2 or less. If you were of mixed blood, I guess that's less than half, less than half, then this is the way it worked. So this is my horrible little table, but you had homestead restriction, or you had homestead allotments, and you had the surplus allotment. Remember that? So say for example, I'm an intermarried white who received an allotment because I'm married to a tribal citizen. Then the Burke Act would allow me to completely would allow me to remove the strict restrictions on my homestead and my surplus allotment, so I could sell them. Okay, so this is specific to people who are intermarried whites, freedmen, or less than 1/2 blood quantum. So then we drop down to if you're between 1/2 to 3/4 Indian blood, all right, 1/2 to 3/4 Indian blood, your homestead remains a restriction, but you can have the restriction on your surplus allotment removed. And if you are 3/4 to full Indian blood, 3/4 to 100%, then nothing changes. Okay? Both your surplus and your homestead have to remain in restricted status, and you cannot sell it. So this is why. This is why there was, the highest blood quantum people remain on the restricted land. The Burke Act was not equal in terms of how it affected the removal of restrictions. Now, all of this changed, as you know, when Collier got into office, and actually a little bit before, on April 26, 1931. It was supposed to go to this, so 1908. So this would be this would be in operation until 1931. And then what the Burke Act did was it said that restrictions may also be removed by the Secretary of the Interior. And what that means is that what the Burke Act did was it moved the process of removing restrictions to the local courts. It's really important. Local courts were able to hear whether or not people wanted to have their restrictions removed. It got it out of the federal responsibility. So this continues. Sorry. So the May 27, 1908 Burke Act also had some sections that referred to things like eminent domain. In other words, railroads going through, roads going through, canals, whatever, basically roads. Because of the need for public works, there was no restriction on the alienation of land if it were needed by the state to establish a right of way or something. So in other words, if there were any public needs for the land and there was a restricted allotment, too bad, okay? That you couldn't divert the movement of a railroad or a road, public road of some sort, by having a restricted allotment in it. Basically, eminent domain was declared on them. So allotted land, whether it's restricted, homesteads, any allotted land under the Burke Act could finally be leased. Okay, so this was a big one. By leasing any restricted homesteads, restricted allotments, then these people could finally get some economic utilization out of the land. But again, this was taken to the county court level. So that's where a lot of the criticism comes from, and Angie DeBow, is that it was the county courts that often usurped the intentions of the law by removing restrictions on people that maybe didn't necessarily want to have them removed. That's the criticism. But those restricted lands could also be released. So the Secretary of the Interior, the BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, assumed a large responsibility over the use of the land. And this is why different types of land use are associated with whether or not the allotment or whether or not the land is in a restricted status or not. Anyway, in the case of the Burke Act, it passed a lot of authority to county courts within the state of Oklahoma and gave them jurisdiction over lands of minor allottees. That is, people, men under the age of 21 and women under the age of 18. Isn't that kind of odd? Women under the age of 18. I think it has to do with things like, general age of getting married or having children. So once the land had its restrictions removed, if an allotment had its restrictions removed, then that land became subject to local taxes, property taxes, and also fell under the authority of state law. Okay, so it can be encumbered now. Once the restrictions are removed, that land can be encumbered. You can establish a lien against it. You can repossess it, and there is basically it's entering the market. So the removal of restrictions was good for some, but the criticism is that because of the local aspect of it, people tended to lose their restricted lands or lose their restrictions quickly. And you know, if somebody had the restrictions removed and then they didn't pay their taxes, then it could go to the county or go to a public sheriff's sale. So, it's a lot. What are the effects of the Burke Act? Most of the lands of the 5 civilized tribes, FCTs, you know, whatever you want to say, 5 civilized tribes, 5 tribes, most of the lands, except for those held by the more traditional populations, the 3/4 blood or more, in relatively isolated places, tended to enter the market when this law took effect in 1908. So this is why Oklahoma is different. This is what makes Oklahoma tribal jurisdictions problematic. This is why in 1934, the Indian Reorganization Act excluded Oklahoma, because Oklahoma had the Burke Act that had given the state lots of authority, lots of local authority. And it would continue to be like that for many years. I just like to throw in a note here that, you know, the people who kind of gloss over Oklahoma history will always say, you know, oh, the land was all stolen. It was all stolen during, you know, after this. Well, no, it wasn't. A lot of people intentionally got rid of their land. You know, perhaps there was a lot of land fraud, but there was also a lot of legitimate sales of land that people didn't want or wanted to dispose of and liquidate because it made sense for them. All right, so let's move on here.
No,
11:13.
11:13. Okay, got it. Okay. Now we've talked a little bit about the Oklahoma or the Wheeler-Howard Act. I just mentioned it. This was the big change that came about with John Collier during the Franklin Roosevelt era and the New Deal, and it established 6, you know, big things. It changed things in 6 big ways. It ended allotment, we know that. It extended that trust period indefinitely on parcels that remained restricted. So it kind of froze them in time in 1934. Of course, that doesn't include Oklahoma lands. That wouldn't affect Oklahoma until 1936. And the Secretary of the Interior, that, you know, for the most part, the federal government took the idea that you know, they could still create new reservations or add on to reservations that were significantly diminished. It also gave the tribes to, you know, this is the big one, number 5. It authorized tribes to adopt constitutions and a process by which they could ratify constitutions. And remember what we said about that process? The federal government said, okay, all of you Indian tribes who want to become formal tribes, you know, want to have a formal tribal council or government, then here's a template for a constitution. You give us your constitution, we'll look it over, make sure everything's good, and if the Secretary of the Interior, you know, the BIA, approves it, then you all can incorporate and act as a, you know, as a public body, act as a corporation too. Remember what a lot of those people said? A lot of the tribes said, we're not interested in that. We're Americans. We don't really want to be members of this tribe in a formal sense. We've done our best to acclimate and to acculturate. And so a significant number of tribes did not participate in this program. Some that actually did vote on it voted against it. So it was only those tribes that were really conscious of their existence and you know, relatively intent on staying tribal in terms of a tribal organization. They're the ones that did this. Now, a lot of them didn't want to do they didn't want to follow the government's rules on how you establish a constitution, because the federal government is assuming they're democratic, right? It kind of throws out any traditional forms of government and just assumes that they have to follow the United States pattern. Number 6, Collier closed all the boarding schools. He was really tired of those, and the boarding school programs were shut down in the 30s. Now some continued on, like Chilocco up here near Ponca City, continued on because it was pretty successful, and it was not necessarily a forced. It wasn't at all a forced boarding school. It was, kids went there to learn, what we used to call sort of the A&M school types of things, farming and machinery, mechanics, that sort of thing, home economics for the women. So those continued on into the 20th century until they largely ran out of money, and the tribes revived. But again, Oklahoma tribes not affected until passage of a separate bill in 1936 called the Oklahoma Indian Welfare Act. So we've talked about PL 280 a little bit. I think we've covered that enough. So for the exam, I want you to be able to identify all of the PL 280 states. I want you to be able to identify, I want you to know that Alaska was the one that was added later, 5 years later. And that, what did PL 280 do? It did what Congress is authorized to do. It gave it gave jurisdiction, civil and criminal jurisdiction over Indian country within certain states to those states. So it allowed those states to assume jurisdiction over the Indian reservations and Indian country within their boundaries. And as I've said before, states quickly found out that they really did not want that jurisdiction. Why would that be?
It's a lot of responsibility for them.
Well, they wanted that responsibility, perhaps to, who knows why. They didn't want a separate jurisdiction. But it came down to money. Right? It came down to money. Who's paying for it? Well, if you're if you're going to have police protection on an Indian reservation and the state's going to provide it, remember there's no taxes collected from those people, so it's a drain on the state coffers to have to create that separate, to extend your force, your police force or whatever, into Indian country, and they're not going to be paying for it. So it didn't affect taxation, it just affected jurisdiction. Now this would be changed later in terms of law enforcement. We'll see some interesting things that happened in the beginning of the 1980s, in which you have the rise of tribal police forces, and later on agreements between tribal police forces and county sheriff's departments, so that they share the ability to enforce the laws. Here's one we haven't talked about: the Indian Civil Rights Act. And this, as you might guess, comes about in the 1960s. 1968, we're heading toward, in 1968, a new era. This is the last year of the termination relocation era, or the sort of the civil rights era. And when Nixon would get into office, he would change Indian policy significantly. But the Indian Civil Rights Act was, what's it sound like? Well, it sounds like a good thing, doesn't it? This is what it is, though. Indian Civil Rights Act required it was a law to affect Indian tribal governments. Indian tribal governments were required to recognize all of the rights that American citizens have under the Bill of Rights. And it was primarily targeted toward a few problems. So the Indian Civil Rights Act just covered American Indians as they were being governed by their tribal governments. So it required Indian tribal governments to follow that, follow constitutional law and not have an exemption from it. Now, it was largely the result of this case, Talton versus Mays, in 1896. Okay, so this is another one of those, there was like a Supreme Court decision, and then it kind of went dormant, and then it was kind of rediscovered. We've talked about that before. Another example, in the case of Talton versus Mays, what happened was there was that particular ruling affected the rights of Indians under tribal law. And what it found was that in 1896, that the individual rights of Indians weren't the same as non-Indians, and they were subject to their tribal law differently than U.S. citizens were subject to United States law or their state laws. So they were, essentially they were not protected equally. This is a violation of the Equal Protection Clause. So the Indian Civil Rights Act was a correction, for the most part, for Indian people relative to their tribal governments. So again, but you think of this, all right, how is that, is this good for tribal sovereignty, or is this a reduction or a dilution of tribal sovereignty?
It's a reduction.
It's a reduction of tribal sovereignty. Is the federal government saying, if you're not playing by the rules that we have as kind of a standard, then you've got to change them. Right? So, in other words, American Indians under the federal government in this law are first American citizens and then secondly tribal citizens. Right? So you're not going to be subject to any unfair laws set forth by your tribe. You're not going to suffer from a failure of a tribal law for equal protection. Now, there is the Talton versus Mays case refers to a murder case in the Cherokee Nation, and this is, I don't know if we've discussed this or not. I don't think we have in this group. In the case of the Talton versus Mays case, the Cherokee law, the tribal law, didn't share the standard of the United States under the Fifth Amendment, and in the Fifth Amendment requirement for capital murder cases, was that the sentence had to be delivered by a grand jury of how many people? By a number of 5 people, and so I think it was 5. And the Cherokee Nation's grand jury wasn't that big. Okay, so this guy appealed, and he appealed in federal court, and he said, Cherokee Nation's sentencing me to death, and they haven't followed the same standard as the United States federal government has to follow for capital murder cases. And so, 1896, what happens? Well, it was in Talton versus Mays when it was interpreted in a few ways. First of all, the federal government was, or at least the Civil Rights Act, would extend those federal protections over American Indians relative to their own tribal governments. The federal government, was essentially mandating a certain standard of tribal governments, And one thing that the federal government did in this is it placed it sort of put the tribes in a certain position relative to the states and relative to the U.S. federal system. So Talton versus Mays, in that case, if you look up that case, and maybe I'll try to elaborate a little bit more on it, but the thing is, Cherokee Nation in 1896 was not required to follow that. And so what happened to Talton? They hanged him. All right, so he lost the case, the way I understand it. I'll go back and make sure that's correct. The Indian Civil Rights Act amended the earlier Public Law 280, 1953, so 15 years later. It amended PL 280 to require tribal consent to allow state jurisdiction. So in other words, if the Omaha tribe in Nebraska didn't want the state of Nebraska enforcing its laws in its reservation, then it could force the state out. So it was, this was some recognition, some degree of recognition to the tribe. All right, so we've talked a little bit about this, but now we're going to really elaborate on it. The law that we're looking at here, the Indian Self-Determination Education Assistance Act, was passed during the administration of President Ford, but it was really the work of Nixon. Nixon had resigned by the time this was passed in Congress. So it was drawn up earlier, but it was eventually passed in 1975. There was a thing called Watergate. If you've ever heard of Watergate, that kind of stalled the country's for about a year or so, kind of like any impeachment hearing does. And but Nixon's this was the law that pretty much enacted what Nixon had envisioned in his earlier statement. And what it does is it transfers federal services, that is, the federal trust obligation. Remember, it's not saying that the federal government doesn't have the trust obligation. It's saying that the services that the United States federal government had always provided from the federal government to the tribes, or to tribal members, that responsibility can be transferred to tribes and tribal governments if they want it. In other words, this is a real Republican thing because it saves money. Okay, it's a way of getting rid of the middleman when it comes to Indian treaty obligations and Indian Health Service, that sort of thing. Law enforcement on tribal lands. So you're with me here? This is the idea that the federal government's going to, like any, in any government agency, you're going to have a lot of waste. Okay, something like 20% of the funding is going to be just stuff that is lost through administrative stuff. So you have the idea here is that you would take the budget from this branch of the Bureau of Indian Affairs that's maybe covering this facet of its obligations to Indian people. Take that, instead of having a federal level and then a tribal level and then how it's enacted with the people, just take that amount of money and give it directly to the tribes and let them use it more efficiently. Use it in the way that makes more sense and allow things to operate a little quicker. So this is this Indian Self-Determination Education Assistance Act, self-determination and passing those federal services back to the tribes, who then provide those services from the tribal level. And again, it was somewhat intended to reduce the power of the Department of the Interior, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, over lives of Indians. But what it generally did was it passed it to the tribe. Now the tribe would be significant to the lives of Indian people. The tribe would be the bureaucracy in many cases. The term devolution is kind of I've never run into this in literature, but this is, to me, is what it really is. The process of devolution. You ever heard of that term in a geography class? Okay. In political geography, devolution is the passing of the authority from the central government to a regional government. Usually that's done to placate an unruly region of a country. And a good example is like in Spain. In Spain, Spain's made up of these different regions. So there are poor regions like up in the northwest, like Galicia, and poor regions up in the northeast, like the Basque Country, and rich regions like Catalonia down in the south. Well, the Basques don't have a lot of political power, and so they have this heritage of sort of being like the Irish Republican Army, or at least they have a small group of people who are separatists, and they would harass the Spanish government with the idea that they wanted separatism. They wanted some sort of autonomy. The Spanish government is never looking to do that. It's kind of like the Turks and the Kurds at the moment. The Turks have no intention on giving Kurdish autonomy to the people in or outside of Turkey. But in the case of the Catalonians, the people in Catalonia, or Catalans, I don't know, Catalonians, people around Barcelona, who are doing really well, they want a little autonomy from the central government. Well, Spain will tend to hand it over to them to keep them happy and make sure that they don't have some kind of separatist mindset. So that's the devolution process, handing power, handing autonomy or authority from the central government to regions. And in the case of the Indian Self-Determination Education Assistance Act of 1975, that's what the federal government basically did for Indian tribes. It handed over autonomy from the central government, from the federal government, to tribal governments, and allowed tribal governments to operate as governments should in serving their population, serving their people. So that's sort of the theoretical side of that. An example of devolution of power from federal to tribal government. And there's a lot of reasons why this is so significant. This particular law was so significant. The Department of the Interior is the main government branch that, or at least the department that houses the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The Bureau of Indian Affairs is part of the Department of the Interior, and the Indian Health Service is part of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. And those two federal agencies would then enter into contracts with the tribes to provide administration of federal programs. So the federal programs weren't cut, they were just rerouted. And so the tribes would then have administrative. So what did this do in 1975? This kind of welded tribal governments into the federal government. See, it made, in a lot of ways, the way that I see it is that tribal governments are really, really guaranteed to exist now because they are basically the conduits for federal money. they're the conduits for the federal programs that had existed. So the Bureau of Indian Affairs is still around, and Indian Health Service is still around, and the Bureau of Indian Education, the BIE, Bureau of Indian Education is an agency within the Department of the Interior that deals with education for Indians. Okay, it's bizarre, but anyway, we have all these big federal agencies that have money to support Indian individuals, Indian people, but now it pretty much is going through the tribes, and the tribes become really part of the bureaucracy of the federal government. I mean, not formally, but they are, are really just branches in some ways of the federal government. Well, this period, this particular law, really ended the idea of termination, because now you needed the tribes. Now the tribes they really have a reason to exist. They have a reason to exist by carrying out that federal trust obligation, mostly through money and through programs that are directed to people who are members of federally recognized tribes. So I put this last note here that old John Collier finally got his way, and it was because of a Republican, believe it or not. So Collier, was a socialist working for Franklin Roosevelt under the New Deal, and he wanted all this stuff. But it was Nixon, a Republican, that made it finally happen. And this really cemented the tribal governments in place. They were now not going to be terminated, because that would break the federal trust obligation, the fiduciary obligation of the federal government. Well, got a little time. Let's finish up with this. Yeah, we got plenty of time. In 1978, not too long after the 1975 bill, Self-Determination and Education Act, this one came up, the Indian Child Welfare Act, 1978. This was strange, but what happened in the 1960s and 1970s, maybe the 1950s, is there was a tendency for American Indian children to be placed into adoption, particularly American Indian children born in reservation poverty during the 60s. They would often be sent off for adoption, and they had a fairly high rate of adoption, but they almost always got adopted by non-Indian families. Okay? And a strange sort of example of this. So what this particular law did was it sought to maximize tribal jurisdiction and minimize state jurisdiction over child custody, things like divorce, abuse, and neglect, in which children are taken away from their parents or separated from one parent. So any time children who were members of tribes, Indian children, anytime Indian children were involved in some kind of domestic custody battle of whatever type, what this law did was it required certain things to happen, and it gave greater power to the tribes, and with the whole idea that Native American children would not be placed in non-Native American families. Okay? Now, it's kind of strange. In my own family, I have a cousin who was adopted, who was a Arapaho, I believe. I can't really remember. I believe he's a Arapaho, full-blood Arapaho, and adopted by my aunt. And so it's a strange situation. But this apparently happened a lot back in the old days, or back in the mid part of the 20th century. And what this intended to do was when American Indian children would be put up for adoption, that they must be adopted by American Indian couples, American Indian families. And this was, of course, back before adoption processes were kind of liberalized, so that now, can single people adopt children now? I think so. Anyway, so Indian children had to be placed with, by priority, extended family members, or they had to go into a tribal member's home. They had to be adopted by another tribal member, or they had to be next, if they couldn't do that, if they couldn't be adopted by a tribal member, they would be adopted by, they would go into a tribal group home, and then if they were not adopted by a tribal member, by group home, this is what? Foster care, right? So foster care in a tribe, and then if not a tribal adoption, you would have an Indian adoption. Just anybody who's an Indian could adopt that person. So 1978, the priority over placement over non-Indian, with a non-Indian family. So these are, the whole idea is that the, and there was federal money to go with it. So this provided federal funding to tribal social welfare offices to support these tribal-oriented programs. The idea that Native Americans would not be eventually eliminated through adoption or through intermarriage, that sort of thing. So what do you think of that? Strong hand of the federal government again? So the federal government's taking a stance to try to keep Indian children within their tribes and keep them from losing their tribal identities. It also ensures that the tribal governments, in the form of their social welfare offices, are again pretty much connected to the federal government. That's about all the time we have today. We'll continue on with this on Thursday. Thank you all for coming, and we'll try to get this posted for you with those slides so that you can see them a little bit better. Have a great week.